Of lectures on science fiction. Today's lecture is lecture number 7, A New Wave of Science Fiction. Now, when talking about the new wave of science fiction, what we're really talking about is a movement described by Moorcock, one of the writers and editors at the time, who was very influential, as a kind of rediscovery of science fiction's visionary roots, and a movement that began creating new conventions which rejected both modernism and the American pulp traditions. We have to remember that the sci-fi begins in the pulp writing era, and later followed by what is called the golden age of science fiction. But now this new wave hitting the 60s and the 70s is influenced by the postmodernist movement happening in America. Often, it's been known in American literature that the early 1900s to the 1950s is allocated as a time period in which modernism was at the height of writing, and postmodernism follows in the 1950s to the 2000s. So, very much entrenched here in that time period, these works were characterized by the same ambitious, self-consciously artistic sensibility that is often seen in postmodernist works. And they concern themselves and the level of content and form with the nature of perception. So, this new wave of science fiction, the term itself, used first by Miller, it is believed, who was a longtime reviewer of the astounding magazine, science fiction magazine, which we talked about a few lectures back. It is used at first to describe works like Aldous and Brunner, but later it incorporates other writers who also take on this style of writing. So the 1968 classic, Stand on Zanzibar, incorporates vignettes about minor characters, ads, headlines, and other collage-like features that give the work itself a very dense texture. It seems very complex. Uh, Aldous, for instance, in 62, his Report on Probability A is an abstract piece that is strongly influenced by the French New Novel movement. So this idea of the new wave um, began not only with these two writers, but took on a life of its own as more writers uh, of science fiction took on the style of the postmodernist writing. So, a style that was very much popularized by writers like William S. Burroughs and Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, all three part of a movement in the 1950s and 60s called the Beat Generation. Now, this this New World magazine that took on the new wave of science fiction, it promised a renaissance of science fiction writing, unconventional form of science fiction, the kind of science fiction that is much more concerned with perception and then with the actual telling of the story. It's often disjointed in the narrative, but it was very much influenced by the likes of Burroughs and the other ones from the Beat generation. So, uh, while the golden age of science fiction included works that we probably know as I, Robot or Martian Chronicles, Fahrenheit 451, and these are all, for the most part, the kinds of works that have a very specific idea and then they pursue that idea, right? What would happen if robots ascend in their understanding? What would their relationships be like with human beings? Although told in as a series of short stories, they are connected, like the Martian Chronicles. What would the last migration of man to Mars be like? Or Fahrenheit 451, what if we lived in a world where we didn't need books anymore, right? A futuristic society where books are encouraged to be burned and so on. So these, the golden age of science fiction, they took on ideas and they developed those ideas thoroughly through both narrative and characterization. But the new wave of science fiction features works like these, works that are often a lot more provocative in their writing. Dangerous Visions, for instance, Dahlgren, the Astro City Exhibition, Stan and Zanzibar, which we talked about already. These works were much more provocative in their telling of the story. So while the traditional writing, we're going to call it that, while the traditional writing, the golden age of science fiction, often wanted to tell to explore a scientific idea, to explore what if this happened, or um, if we continue down this road, what would occur. The new writing of the new wave was much more skeptical and often wanted to disassociate itself from the pulp fiction style of writing. You can think of this new wave style of writing almost as the precursor to shows like Black Mirror or Electric Dreams on Amazon Prime. These are all shows that involve stories, by the way, from these writers of the new wave, and they're much more interested in what science does to people, not so much how science fiction plays out in the story. So writers, for instance, like J.G. Ballard, these one of these writers explores the idea of psychological states and perceptions rather than outer space. He has an editorial, Which Way to Inner Space, which is very interesting because in it he explores not so much what happens to these characters or to characters when they go out into space, right? But the very idea that we can explore the inner workings of the mind or the inner workings of a person through science fiction. That was much more fascinating to him, and works like The Wind from Nowhere or The Drowned World or The Burning World, or the Crystal World. So these are very abstract and they explore human nature in relation to technology. So why the new wave? Well, the new wave is often thought of a deliberate attempt to elevate the literary and stylistic quality of science fiction. Science fiction, for the most part, prior to this, it was a niche taste, but it was also not the kind of established literature that would be later respected as it is today. And not all of science fiction is still respected, but since it's so pervasive, it's become much more common, especially in media, like movies, TV shows, and things like that. So this idea that it wanted to disassociate itself from the pulp writers and establish itself as the kind of writing that is ingenious and is fleshed out, the of things that are new, and it brings novelty to the sci-fi writing. So this new wave wanted to take to want to be more concerned with the content and the ideas than with the form or the style of aesthetics. So this new wave, it, its purpose was to establish itself as a powerhouse of writing, especially in the postmodernist movement in American writing. So the question has often been asked if the new wave literature is still science fiction, since it does have a lot of fiction, but the science is so minimal, and the science is often about human relations instead. Well, the ideas explored by these works reflect the central desire of the new wave of science fiction, that it wants to be taken seriously, and it is still aligned with the genre itself of science fiction. So while science fiction may explore aliens, let's say this work may explore instead the alienation of characters from other people or even from themselves. So these works are still the kinds of science fiction that we would consider. Now, here are some of the main characteristics of this new wave of science fiction that I think are most important to remember as we conclude this lecture. First, it fits right in with the postmodern movement of literature, and that's important because this movement not only influences the mainstream style of writing, but it influences every other style of writing, including science fiction. Some of its key features, especially in these new works, bizarre fascination with taboos, an interest in mind altering drugs, fixation on spirituality or Eastern religions, a focus on sex and pop art, and also a willingness to talk about things that people were not usually talking about in writing, I mean. And these works are also much more pessimistic about the future, uh, focused often on the likelihood of a certain disaster, which is why in the last lecture when we talked about the wasteland, these works fall very much within the sub movement or the style of the apocalyptic style of writing. The writing style wanted to be experimental, broke the usual storytelling format and the rules that are associated with telling of a story. And it often presented psychological explorations and metaphorical stories, some of which um, do lead you to the question, is what's the new wave of science fiction still science fiction? But the world that science fiction inhabits today has very much been influenced by that new wave, as much as it was by the golden age of science fiction. Okay?